The oppressive silence of the gilded quill was a weight Julian Croft could feel in his bones. It was Boston's oldest, most exclusive dining establishment, a place where fortunes were whispered into existence over lobster thermidor and centuries-old port. For Julian, a man who had built a global logistics empire on the principles of noise, motion, and relentless efficiency, the silence was a personal failure. It emanated from the small boy sitting opposite him, his son, Leo. 7 years old, with his father's raven hair and his mother's soulful dark eyes, Leo was a perfect miniature of a dynasty. Yet, for 5 of those 7 years, not a single word had passed his lips. Not since the night his mother, Isabella, had been stolen from them by a drunk driver. 5 years of a silence so profound it had become its own entity in their sprawling Beacon Hill townhouse. A ghost at the dinner table, a shadow in the hallways. "Mr. Croft, your usual table is ready." The maitre d', a man named Philip, who had served 3 generations of Boston's elite, spoke in the hushed tones reserved for libraries and funerals. Julian nodded curtly, his hand hovering over Leo's shoulder without making contact. The boy's focus was absolute, fixed on the grand regulator clock that dominated the restaurant's foyer. Its polished brass pendulum swung in a slow, hypnotic arc, a silent metronome counting out the seconds of his son's soundless existence. Julian had bought and sold companies larger than most countries. He had stared down hostile boards and navigated treacherous market collapses. But he could not solve the intricate, heartbreaking puzzle of his own child. They were seated in a secluded alcove, the city lights of Boston glittering like a carpet of fallen stars beyond the leaded glass windows. Julian ordered for them both, a filet mignon for himself, a simple plate of roasted chicken and potatoes for Leo, who ate with a delicate precision that belied his age. They had tried everything. The best child psychologists from Mass General, behavioral therapists from Stanford, even a fringe holistic retreat in the mountains of Sedona that cost more than a small private jet. Nothing had breached the fortress of Leo's silence. Tonight was a new low. Another specialist, a Dr. Albright with a string of degrees and a voice of condescending sympathy, had used the word permanent. He'd suggested institutionalization might be the most supportive environment for a case this severe. Julian had nearly thrown the man out of his corner office. His son was not a case. He was a boy grieving a mother he barely remembered, locked in a world Julian couldn't access. Footsteps, light and hesitant on the Persian rug, approached their table. Julian looked up, his jaw tight, ready to dismiss the server with his usual brusque efficiency. And then he saw her. She was young, perhaps 24 or 25, with waves of honey-blonde hair escaping a simple, low ponytail. Her eyes, a startling shade of blue-grey, were wide and observant. She wore the standard black dress and white apron of the waitstaff, but she held herself with a quiet stillness that seemed out of place amidst the clatter and hum of the restaurant. There was a fragile, almost wounded quality to her, as if she were trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. "Good evening, Mr. Croft." Her voice was low, melodic. "My name is Alara. I'll be your server tonight." Julian grunted in acknowledgement, his gaze already returning to Leo. The boy was tapping his fingers on the tablecloth. It wasn't a random fidget. It was a pattern. Tap, 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 tap. A complex, rhythmic sequence Julian had seen 1,000 times but never understood. "He'll have the chicken. I'll have the filet, medium rare, and a bottle of the 82 Margot." He delivered the order without looking at her, but Alara didn't move. Julian could feel her gaze, not on him, but on his son. He looked up, a sharp retort on his lips, but the expression on her face stopped him cold. It wasn't pity. He loathed pity. It was recognition, a deep, focused attention, as if she were listening to a piece of music no one else could hear. Her eyes were on Leo's hands. Tap, 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 tap. "Is there a problem?" Julian's voice was ice. He was accustomed to the stares, the whispers. He'd built walls of wealth and power to shield his son from them. But here, in this quiet alcove, they felt exposed. Ilara's cheeks colored slightly. "No, sir. My apologies." She paused, her gaze still on Leo's rhythmic tapping. It's a beautiful rhythm. It's in a 7/8 time signature. Uncommon." Julian stared at her. Time signature? It was just a nervous habit, a tic. Before he could dismiss her, she did something extraordinary. She didn't speak to Leo. She didn't try to make eye contact. She simply brought her own hand to the edge of the service tray she was holding, and with her own fingers quietly tapped back a response. Not the same rhythm, but a complementary one, a harmony. Tap, 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 tap. For the first time in 5 years, Leo's hand stopped. His head, which was always slightly bowed, lifted. His dark, vacant eyes shifted from the tablecloth to the source of the new rhythm. He looked at Ilara. Not through her, not past her, but ate her. His gaze, for one breathtaking, impossible second, was clear. Connected. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs. Specialists with decades of experience couldn't get Leo to make eye contact. They used flashcards, puppets, rewards. This waitress with a simple tap on a silver tray had done it in 10 seconds. The moment passed. Leo's gaze dropped back to the table, the veil of absence descending once more. But Julian had seen it. The flicker, the spark in the void. Ilara seemed to realize she had overstepped. A look of something akin to panic crossed her face. "I'm sorry, sir. That was unprofessional. I'll put your order in immediately." She turned to flee, but Julian's voice, rough with an emotion he couldn't name, stopped her. "Wait." She froze, her back to him. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice low and intense. She turned slowly, her hands twisting in her apron. I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me," Julian snapped, his corporate raider instincts taking over. "My son has not looked at a stranger, not really looked, since his mother died. You did something? What was it?" Ilara's gaze darted from Julian's demanding face to Leo's small, withdrawn form. The professional mask was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. "He wasn't just fidgeting," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was communicating, in rhythm. I just answered him in a language he was already speaking." The words struck Julian with the force of a physical blow, a language he was already speaking. For 5 years, Julian had been trying to force Leo to speak his language, the language of words, of response, of normalcy. It had never occurred to him that Leo might have a language of his own, one that Julian had been too deaf to hear. He leaned forward, the multi-million-dollar wine and the perfectly cooked steak forgotten. The entire restaurant, the entire world, faded away, leaving only this timid waitress and the impossible hope she had just ignited in his chest. "I have a proposition for you," he said, his voice dropping to the register he used for closing deals that changed skylines. "Quit this job. Today. Work for me." Ilara's eyes widened in alarm. "Mr. Croft, I'm a waitress. I'm not a therapist. I have no qualifications." "I don't care about your qualifications," he cut her off, his mind racing. "I care about what I just saw. Spend time with my son. Talk to him in this language of yours. Get him to say one word. Just one. He took a breath and made the kind of offer he understood best, one so large it was impossible to refuse. If you can make my son speak, I will give you a full year of my salary. The air crackled. A year of his salary. Public records put his official income at over $20 million, not including bonuses and stock options. It was a life-altering, country-buying sum of money. He expected her to gasp, to stammer, to accept with tearful gratitude. Instead, Elara's expression hardened. The fragility was replaced by a sudden, unexpected spine of steel. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and grim. "No," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. Julian blinked, thrown completely off balance. In his world, no one said no to that kind of money. I beg your pardon. Your son isn't a broken machine that you can pay someone to fix, Mr. Croft," she said, her blue-grey eyes flashing with a fire he hadn't seen before. "He's a child. And his silence, it's there for a reason. Trying to buy it away is not only wrong, it's cruel." For the second time that night, Julian Croft was speechless. This young woman, who likely survived on minimum wage and tips, had not only rejected a fortune, but had just dressed him down as if he were a negligent intern. He should have been furious, insulted. He should have had her fired. Instead, a single thought consumed him. "Who are you?" Before he could formulate a response, Leo's small hand, which had been still since the exchange of rhythms, reached out. It didn't reach for his father or for his glass of water. It crept across the white linen, his small fingers stretching toward the spot on the table where Elara's hand had rested. He didn't touch anything, but the intention was unmistakable. He was reaching for her, reaching for the music. Elara saw it too. The fire in her eyes softened, replaced by an expression of profound, aching sadness. It was a look of shared understanding, a sorrow that seemed far too old for her young face. "I'll bring your dinner," she whispered, and before Julian could stop her, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the warm glow of the kitchen. Julian stared after her, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion. Hope. He looked down at Leo's hand, still outstretched on the table. For 5 years, he had been shouting into a void, trying to pull his son out. This quiet waitress had shown him that maybe, just maybe, the answer wasn't to pull, but to listen, to learn a new language. And he was suddenly, desperately certain that she was the only one in the world who could teach him. 2 days later, Julian found himself in a place he hadn't set foot in since he was a child, the employee alley behind the Gilded Quill. It was nearly midnight, and a damp Boston chill crept through his custom-tailored Brioni suit. He had spent the last 48 hours having his private security team, a discreet firm run by ex-Mossad agents, compile a dossier on Elara Vance. The results were both thin and deeply unsettling. She lived in a tiny apartment in Alston, paid her rent on time, and had no criminal record. She'd been working at the restaurant for 8 months. Before that, for 2 years, she simply didn't exist. No credit history, no tax records, no digital footprint. It was as if she had deliberately and systematically erased herself. The only clue was her past. Before the 2-year gap, she had been a prodigy. Elara Vance, the gifted cellist, accepted into Juilliard at 16. She'd studied composition, winning accolades and scholarships. Her professor's notes, which his team had managed to unearth, described her as having a rare, intuitive understanding of music as a form of pure emotional communication. And then, just before her final year, she had vanished. She'd withdrawn from the school, abandoned her scholarship, and sold her cello, a priceless 18th century instrument. The trail went cold until she reappeared in Boston, serving overpriced steak to men like him. The back door of the restaurant creaked open, and she emerged, pulling a threadbare coat around her shoulders. She stopped dead when she saw him leaning against his black Bentley, a silhouette of power in the grimy alley. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice wary. "Are you stalking your waitstaff now?" "I'm pursuing an investment," Julian replied, pushing himself off the car. "We need to finish our conversation." "I believe I gave you my answer." "You refused my money," he conceded, "which only makes me more convinced you're the right person. Everyone I know can be bought. You can't. That makes you either a fool or invaluable. I'm betting on the latter." She hugged her coat tighter, her eyes scanning the alley as if looking for an escape route. "I can't help you. What you saw in the restaurant, it was a fluke." "It wasn't a fluke, and you know it," Julian pressed, stepping closer. "Juilliard. The cello. The composition awards. You don't just understand music, you speak it. That's what you did with Leo. You spoke his language." Her face went ashen. The mention of her past was like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there, revealing a room full of pain. "You had me investigated." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of weary fact. "I had to," he said, his voice softening slightly. "My son is everything to me. I need to know who I'm dealing with." "Then you should know to stay away from me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The reason I left that world, the reason I stopped. Music isn't a gift for me, Mr. Croft. Not anymore. It's a curse. It's tied to—" She choked on the words, unable to continue. Julian's investigative report had found the reason. A single, tragic newspaper clipping from her hometown in rural Vermont. A story about a farming accident. A younger brother named Daniel, deaf since birth, who had been killed. Ilara, then 18, had been the only one with him. The details were sparse, but the timeline matched her withdrawal from Juilliard perfectly. "Daniel," Julian said softly. The name hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back a step, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror and grief. How dare you?" "I'm not trying to hurt you," Julian said, holding up his hands. "I'm trying to understand. You and your brother communicated through music, didn't you? Through rhythm and vibration?" Tears streamed down her face, silent and devastating. She nodded, unable to speak. "You're not cursed, Ilara. You're gifted. And my son is trapped in the same silence your brother was. You reached him. You can reach him again." He took a step closer, his voice dropping, pleading. "I'm not asking you to be a therapist. I'm asking you to be a translator. Help me understand my son. Help him understand he's not alone." He paused, abandoning the transactional approach that had failed him so spectacularly before. "Please, I'm begging you. Not as a CEO, but as a father who is lost." The raw desperation in his voice, the stripping away of his power and pride, seemed to breach her defenses. She looked at him, her own grief-stricken eyes seeing the reflection of his. "If I do this," she said, her voice hoarse, "it's not for your money. I don't want a single dollar." "Then what do you want?" "My terms," she said, the steel returning to her voice. "We do this my way. No doctors watching through two-way mirrors. No analysts taking notes. No pressure, no timelines. Just me and Leo, and time. And if I say we stop, we stop. No questions asked." It was a complete surrender of control, anathema to every instinct that had made Julian Croft who he was, but the image of Leo's hand reaching for her flashed in his mind. Deal, he said, extending his hand. She looked at it for a long moment before taking it. Her hand was small and cold, but her grip was surprisingly firm. Tomorrow, she said, pulling her hand back. There's an old clock shop on Charles Street. Horologium. Meet me there with Leo at 3 o'clock. And Mr. Croft? Julian. He corrected her softly. Her expression didn't change. Come alone. And be prepared to wait. Some conversations take time. She turned and walked away down the dark alley, leaving Julian standing by his $500,000 car, feeling as if he'd just closed the most important deal of his life, with terms he didn't fully understand, for a price that had nothing to do with money. He was placing the fate of his son, the very heart of his world, into the hands of a wounded girl who was running from a ghost, and for the first time in a long time, he felt he was finally doing something right. Horologium was a place lost in time. The air inside was thick with the scent of brass polish and cedar oil, and the gentle, cacophonous ticking of 100 different clocks filled the space with a living, breathing pulse. Leo, who usually resisted any new environment, was captivated. His eyes, wide with wonder, moved from the towering grandfather clocks to the delicate, bird-like movements of the cuckoo clocks lining the walls. Elara was already there, speaking quietly with the elderly proprietor. She was dressed simply in jeans and a soft grey sweater, her hair tied back. She looked less like a waitress and more like a student, but there was a new resolve in her posture. "Hello, Leo," she said, her voice calm and gentle as they approached. She didn't look at Julian. Her focus was entirely on the boy. She knelt down to his level, careful to keep a respectful distance. There are so many voices in this room, aren't there? Each one telling its own story. She held out her hand, not to him, but to the air between them. In her palm lay a small, antique music box made of inlaid rosewood. "This was my brother's," she said softly. "It plays a song only he and I knew." Julian watched, his breath held. This was it. The first session. He expected her to push, to prompt, to try and elicit a response. Instead, she simply sat on a small wooden stool, placed the music box on a workbench, and opened the lid. A tinkling, delicate melody filled the small shop, a simple arpeggio that was both melancholic and sweet. It rose above the ticking of the clocks, a clear, pure voice in a crowded room. Elara didn't watch Leo. She closed her eyes, a faint, sad smile on her lips, and just listened. Leo, who had been frozen by the door, took a hesitant step forward. Then another. He moved toward the workbench, his gaze locked on the tiny, rotating cylinder and the plucking metal teeth of the music box. He stood beside Elara, his small hands gripping the edge of the bench, and watched, mesmerized. Julian remained by the door, feeling like an intruder. The proprietor had discreetly vanished into a back room. It was just the three of them, surrounded by the relentless, gentle passage of time. For an hour, nothing happened. Elara played the music box, letting it run down, then winding it back up. Leo just stood and watched, utterly still, utterly absorbed. There was no breakthrough, no word, no grand gesture. As the hour mark passed, Julian felt a familiar prickle of impatience. This was it? This was the plan? To sit in silence? He shifted his weight, and a floorboard creaked loudly. Leo flinched, the spell broken. He looked up, his eyes finding his father's, and the familiar veil of anxiety descended. He took a step back from the workbench, his hands balling into fists. Elara opened her eyes. She looked at Julian, and her expression was not angry, but disappointed. She gently closed the lid of the music box, silencing the melody. "That's enough for today," she said quietly. On the drive home, the The silence in the Bentley was heavier than ever. Julian felt like he had failed a test he didn't know he was taking. He had promised her time, and his own impatience had shattered the delicate peace she had created. But as they pulled into the garage of their townhouse, the valet opening the door, Leo did something he hadn't done in years. He resisted. He didn't want to get out of the car. He tugged on Julian's sleeve, his eyes wide and insistent. Then he pointed back in the direction they had come, toward the clock shop, toward her. It wasn't a word, but it was the clearest communication Julian had received from his son in 5 years. "I want to go back." The weeks that followed settled into a new, quiet rhythm. Twice a week they would meet Ilara. Never at the sterile townhouse, but in places she chose, the echoing halls of the Museum of Fine Arts, where they would sit before the Impressionist paintings while Ilara hummed the melodies of Debussy. A windswept pier on the harbour, where she taught Leo the rhythmic patterns of the foghorns and the seabirds. An empty church, where she played the organ, filling the cavernous space with soaring, powerful chords that made the stained glass windows seem to vibrate with life. She never asked Leo for anything. She simply shared her world, the world of sound and music and rhythm she had once abandoned. She was reintroducing herself to her own language, and in doing so, she was giving it to his son. Leo began to change. The rigid anxiety in his small body started to soften. He began to carry a small notebook and a pencil, not to write words, but to draw. He drew the gears of the clocks, the pipes of the organ, the intricate patterns of sound waves Ilara showed him on her phone. He was cataloguing his new world. Julian, meanwhile, was learning the hardest lesson of his life: how to be present without being in control. He would sit on a bench 50 feet away in the park, or stand in the back of the museum gallery, and just watch. He saw his son's shoulders relax. He saw him, on a rainy Tuesday in the public garden, tap a rhythm on a park bench, and saw Ilara, sitting beside him, smile and tap back a reply. He was witnessing a conversation, and the fact that he couldn't understand it didn't matter. What mattered was that it was happening. He also saw the toll it was taking on Ilara. Sometimes, after a session, he would see her sitting alone in her car, her head resting against the steering wheel, a profound exhaustion on her face. He knew that for her, every note, every rhythm, was a memory of her brother. She was walking through a graveyard to lead his son into the light, and the courage of that took his breath away. His feelings for her began to shift, evolving from gratitude into a deep, unnerving admiration. He found himself noticing the way the light caught her hair, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her delicate hands. It was a dangerous, complicated feeling, and he pushed it down, telling himself that Leo was the only thing that mattered. The call from his mother, Eleanor Croft, was inevitable. "Julian, darling," her voice, crisp and commanding, crackled over the phone. "I'm hearing the most peculiar rumors that you've dismissed Dr. Albright and hired a waitress?" Eleanor Croft was the matriarch of one of Boston's founding families. She viewed the world as a series of assets and liabilities, and to her, Leo's silence was a significant liability to the family's reputation. "Her name is Ilara Vance, Mother, and she's not a waitress anymore. She's helping Leo." "Helping him how? By serving him canapés? The boy needs professional intervention, not a playmate from the working class. The board of the Children's Hospital is hosting their annual Benefactors Gala next month. I expect you to be there. With Leo. And without this person, it's time to present a united, strong front." "We'll be there," Julian said, a sudden, reckless idea forming in his mind. "All 3 of us." The silence on the other end of the line was colder than a Boston winter. "Don't you dare embarrass this family, Julian. I will not have the Croft name associated with some fortune-hunting nobody." The line went dead. Julian knew what he was about to do was a declaration of war. He was about to bring Elara, a woman with a buried past and no social standing, into the lion's den. But he also knew he couldn't face it without her. She had become, in a few short weeks, the anchor for both him and his son. The night of the gala, Elara stood in the grand foyer of Julian's townhouse, looking like a ghost of her former self. Julian had sent a stylist from Newbury Street to her apartment with a selection of gowns, and she had chosen the simplest one, a column of deep midnight blue silk that made her skin seem luminous, and her eyes look like stormy seas. Her hair was swept up, revealing the elegant line of her neck. She was breathtaking, but her hands were trembling. "I can't do this," she whispered, her eyes wide with anxiety as she took in the opulence of the house. "These people, your mother, they'll eat me alive." "They'll try," Julian said, adjusting his black tie. He'd never felt so protective of anyone in his life. "Just stay with me. You're not there as a guest. You're there as Leo's guardian, his translator. That's your armor." Leo came running down the grand staircase, a rare burst of energy. He was wearing a tiny tuxedo, his hair neatly combed. He stopped in front of Elara, his eyes shining. He held up his notebook. On the page was a drawing of 3 figures holding hands: a tall man, a small boy, and a woman in a blue dress. Elara's breath caught. She knelt down, her silk dress pooling on the marble floor, and wrapped her arms around him in a fierce, protective hug. "It's beautiful, Leo," she whispered into his hair. When she stood up, the fear in her eyes had been replaced by determination. "Okay," she said to Julian. For him, the ballroom of the Copley Plaza was a glittering shark tank. Diamonds and ambition dripped from every guest. As they entered, a hush fell over the room, followed by a wave of whispers. Julian felt Elara flinch beside him, and he instinctively placed a hand on the small of her back. Eleanor Croft descended upon them like a bird of prey, her silver gown shimmering, her smile a slash of red lipstick. Her eyes flickered over Elara with dismissive contempt before settling on Leo. "Julian, you actually did it. You brought her." Her voice was a low, furious hiss. "Mother, this is Elara Vance. Elara, my mother, Eleanor Croft." "Miss Vance," Eleanor said, not offering a hand. "I'm sure you feel quite out of your depth. The server's entrance is in the back, in case you get lost." Before Julian could retaliate, Elara met his mother's gaze with a calm that stunned him. "Mrs. Croft, it's a pleasure. I've heard so much about your commitment to children's causes. It's truly inspiring." The polite, unruffled response threw Eleanor off. She narrowed her eyes. "And what is it you do, exactly, Miss Vance? Besides pour coffee?" The cruelty was designed to humiliate, to make Elara shrink. Julian's hand tightened on her back, ready to pull her away, to unleash his fury on his mother. But Elara stood her ground. "I listen," Elara said simply. The answer was so unexpected, so strange, that Eleanor was momentarily silenced. But she recovered quickly, her smile turning venomous. She had clearly done her own research. "Is that what you were doing for your brother, Daniel?" Eleanor's voice was now dangerously soft, but it carried in the sudden lull of the crowd around them. "Listening, because my sources tell me you were the only one there when he died." Such a tragedy. They say the silence on that farm was deafening. It was a kill shot. The color drained from Elara's face. The air left her lungs. Julian could feel the tremor that went through her entire body. The carefully constructed composure she had worn all night shattered into a million pieces. The ghosts she had been running from had finally caught her, right here, in the middle of this glittering ballroom. He saw the old familiar panic in her eyes, the instinct to flee. Julian stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "That's enough, Mother." "Is it?" Eleanor retorted, sensing victory. "I think it's important for us to know who we're entrusting our family to. A broken musician with a past so tragic she had to erase it. She didn't save her own brother. What makes you think she can save your son?" Ilara made a small, wounded sound and took a step back, her hands coming up to cover her mouth. The whispers around them grew louder. The sharks were circling, smelling blood. And then, something happened that no one could have predicted. Leo, who had been standing silently between them, let go of Julian's hand. He looked at Ilara's devastated face. He looked at his grandmother's triumphant one, and his small face, for the first time Julian could remember, hardened with anger. He walked away from them, his small tuxedo a stark black against the polished floor. He walked toward the grand piano that sat on a small stage at the end of the ballroom. The crowd parted for him, murmuring in confusion. He climbed onto the piano bench. His feet didn't even reach the pedals. His small hands, which Julian had only ever seen tap or draw, hovered over the tuors. The ivory keys, stark as bone under the ballroom's chandeliers, seemed to hold the echo of the impossible. A single, clear note still hung in the air, a ghost of a sound that had shattered 5 years of silence. Then another, and another. Daniel's song, a melody of grief and memory, played by the small, determined hands of a boy who had just found his voice. The world had fractured into a million crystalline moments. The collective gasp of Boston's elite, the shattered mask of triumph on Eleanor Croft's face, replaced by a stark, uncomprehending shock. Ilara, a statue of midnight silk, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks, her hands pressed to her mouth as if to hold in a sound too raw for this gilded cage. And Julian, feeling the foundations of his world, of his very identity, crumble and reform into something new and unrecognizable. Leave her alone. The words were not a child's plea. They were a decree. Quiet, rusted from disuse, yet imbued with an authority that silenced the entire cavernous room. They were a shield, forged in the fire of his grandmother's cruelty, and held up to protect the one person who had not tried to fix him, but had simply learned his language. Time seemed to stutter, to bend around the small boy on the piano bench. Leo slid down, his tiny tuxedo shoes making no sound on the polished floor. He walked past his stunned father, past the gaping onlookers, his path as straight and true as a conductor's baton. He walked to Ilara. Her sobs were audible now, a wrenching sound of grief and gratitude, of a pain so deep it could only be answered by a miracle. Leo reached her, his small hand finding hers, his grip surprisingly firm. He looked up, his dark eyes, once vacant voids, now clear, present, and filled with a fierce, protective light. "It's okay, Ilara," he said, his voice stronger, steadier. "I'm here." He had not spoken to ask for something. He had not spoken to declare his own presence. He had spoken to give comfort. The silent boy, who had been lost in a world no one could enter, had found his way out not for himself, but to rescue another. He had broken his own silence to shatter hers. Ilara collapsed, sinking to her knees in a pool of silk, pulling him into an embrace that was less a hug and more an anchoring. She buried her face in the crook of his small neck, her body shaking with the force of her release. And Julian Croft, the orchestrator of empires, the man who bent the world to his will, could do nothing but watch. He was a spectator to the most important event of his life. He looked at his mother, her face a ruin of public defeat, and the distant pity he felt was less an emotion and more a final, quiet closing of a door. She had weaponized the past, and in doing so had unwittingly unlocked a future she could never comprehend, a future built on a foundation she had just tried to obliterate. A future where a boy's love was a force more powerful than a dynasty's legacy. The ride back to the Beacon Hill townhouse was not silent. It was filled with the deafening roar of what had just transpired. Julian drove, his hands gripping the Bentley's leather-wrapped steering wheel with a tightness that betrayed the tremor running through his body. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Leo was in the back, nestled against Ilara, his head on her lap. He had fallen asleep almost instantly, the Herculean effort of the evening having utterly drained him. His small face, in repose, looked younger than his 7 years, peaceful. Ilara was not sleeping. She stared out the window, her silhouette rigid against the blur of city lights. Her tears had stopped, but Julian could feel the storm raging within her. The gala, his mother, Leo's voice. It had all been a crucible, and he feared it had burned away what little peace she had found. The atmosphere in the car was thick with unspoken words, with the volatile chemistry of trauma, relief, and terror. When they arrived, the valet opened the door with his usual deference, but his eyes widened slightly at the scene. Julian waved him off, lifting his sleeping son into his arms. The familiar weight of him was different tonight. He felt both heavier and lighter, a paradox of presence. He carried him upstairs, the boy's soft breathing a steady rhythm against his chest. He tucked him into bed, the moonlight from the large window striping the comforter, and for a long moment he just stood there, watching his son breathe. The silence in the room was not the oppressive, empty silence of before. This was a resting silence, a silence between notes. He found Ilara in the living room, a cavernous space of glass and steel that overlooked the city. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, a solitary figure in her borrowed finery. She looked fragile enough to be shattered by a harsh word, yet she was radiating an intensity that kept him at a distance. "I keep hearing it," Julian said, his voice low, careful not to break the spell. His voice. I thought I might have imagined it. He shouldn't have had to do that. Her reply was toneless, directed at the glittering cityscape below. "He saw me break, Julian. He felt it, and he stepped in front of your mother's attack to shield me." Her voice cracked on the last word. "He used his voice, his miracle, to save me. A 7-year-old boy. That is a burden he should never have to carry." "He defended someone he loves," Julian said gently, taking a tentative step closer. "That's not a burden, Ilara. That's a gift. It's a debt." She spun to face him, her blue-grey eyes blazing with a self-lacerating fury. "It's a debt he'll spend his life paying if I stay. Your mother was right. She may be a monster, but she saw the truth. I am a walking ghost story. And tonight, I dragged your son into the haunting." The raw agony in her voice stopped him cold. This was more than guilt. It was a core belief she held about herself, a conviction that she was a source of contagion, of tragedy. "The day Daniel died," she whispered, the words seeming to tear their way out of her throat. "The sun was so bright. We were by the old silo. The air was thick with the smell of cut hay and dust. I was 18. I was going to Juilliard. I was invincible." She gave a hollow, broken laugh. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, his eyes closed, a little smile on his face. He loved to feel the vibrations of the cello through the soles of his feet. That was our secret. I could make him feel the music. She was looking through Julian now, seeing a sun-drenched Vermont field. I was playing Bach, the cello suite number 1. I got lost in it. You know that feeling? When the world just disappears and there's only the notes, only the voice of the instrument. I was his ears, Julian. That was the deal. I was supposed to be listening to the world for both of us. But I was selfish. I was listening only to myself. Her breath hitched, a ragged, painful sound. I never heard the tractor. The farmer was backing up. He couldn't see. Daniel couldn't hear it. But I should have. I should have felt the vibration in the ground. I should have heard it over the music. But I didn't. The music stopped. And then there was just silence. A different kind. A terrible kind. Your mother talked about the deafening silence on that farm. She has no idea. The story, confessed in its full, devastating detail, filled the space between them. It was a weight he could almost feel, a shroud of guilt she had worn for years, the reason she had silenced her own music, her own life. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. The wound was too deep for such simple balms. Instead, he spoke his own truth. After Isabella died, he began, his voice quiet, stripped of all its usual command. The world went silent for me, too. She was a painter. Her world was explosive with color. Vermilion, cerulean, ochre. And when she was gone, it all turned to ash, just shades of grey. I thought Leo's silence was a manifestation of that greyness, a problem to be solved, a flaw in the system. I brought in specialists, analysts, strategists. I tried to fix my son the way I'd fix a failing subsidiary. He finally met her gaze, his own eyes holding a reflection of her pain. I was deaf too, Ilara. I couldn't hear the language he was speaking, a language of pure, unbearable grief. I was shouting instructions into a void when I should have been leaning in and listening. You didn't drag him into your haunting. You walked into his. You were the only one who heard him. You gave him a language to find his way out. And in doing so, you taught me how to listen. You gave me back my son. He closed the remaining distance between them. The air crackled. This was a precipice, a moment of terrifying vulnerability for them both. He reached out, not with the confidence of a man used to taking what he wants, but with the hesitation of someone asking for permission. His hand came to rest on her arm, his thumb stroking the smooth silk of her sleeve. The contact was electric, a jolt of shared humanity. This was never about a job, he said, his voice barely a whisper. This was never about money. Her eyes searched his, wide and luminous with unshed tears. She was looking for a reason to run, to retreat into the anonymous safety she had built for herself. He could see the war within her. Julian, she breathed, and his name was a question, a plea, a surrender. He didn't kiss her. The moment was too fragile, too sacred for that. A kiss would have been a conclusion, and this, he knew, was a beginning. Instead, he simply held her gaze, letting the profound, unspoken truth of their connection settle around them. They were two broken people who, in trying to save a little boy, had inadvertently shown each other a way to be whole. "Stay," he said, the word a quiet offering, not a demand, not for a job, not even for Leo. "Stay, and let's just be quiet together for a while. Let's see what grows in the silence." Before she could answer, a small sound came from the hallway. "I'm thirsty." Leo stood in the doorway, clutching his blanket, his hair tousled from sleep. He looked at them, standing so close in the dim light, and his expression was one of simple, sleepy acceptance. He padded over, his small hand slipping into Ilara's. He then reached for Julian's, his fingers linking the three of them into a chain. He looked at their joined hands, then up at their faces. He gave a small, contented sigh. "Good," he said. The single word a perfect, simple pronouncement. Ilara looked at Julian over Leo's head. Her lips parted, and for a moment he thought she would speak, would give him the answer he so desperately wanted. Instead, she simply squeezed his hand. It was enough. It was everything. It was not a surrender, but a choice. A hesitant, terrifying, beautiful choice to stop running from the ghosts of the past and to face the promise of a new morning. The next day did not dawn with trumpets. It arrived with the soft grey light of a Boston morning and the smell of coffee. Julian had woken on the sofa, having given Ilara the guest suite. He found her in the kitchen with Leo. She was dressed in the simple jeans and sweater she'd arrived in a lifetime ago. Leo sat at the vast marble island, a glass of orange juice in front of him. He was holding a spoon, looking at his reflection in it. "Why?" he asked, his voice soft and curious. "Is my face upside down?" Ilara, leaning against the counter, smiled. It was the first genuine smile Julian had seen from her, a small, tentative sunrise. "It's called a concave surface. The light bends," she began, explaining the simple physics with the patience of a born teacher. Julian watched from the doorway, his heart aching with a strange and wonderful joy. It was so normal. A boy asking a question, an adult giving an answer. This simple domesticity was a treasure more valuable than his entire portfolio. He cleared his throat, and they both looked up. Ilara's smile faded slightly, the uncertainty returning. "I have something for you," Julian said, walking over. He placed a single sheet of paper on the counter. It was not a contract. It was not a check. It was a printout with an address in rural Vermont and a name. Aletheia. "My team is good at finding things," he said quietly, so Leo wouldn't hear. "When you sold your cello, it was bought by a collector. He passed away. His family sold it to this man, a craftsman who restores old instruments. It's still there. He's been waiting for the right musician to come along." He paused. "It's not a gift. It's not a demand. It's just information. So you know where it is. So you know that part of you is not gone. It's just waiting." Ilara stared at the paper, her hand hovering over it, as if it might burn her. She looked up at him, and her eyes were filled with a dawning understanding. He wasn't trying to fix her. He wasn't trying to buy her. He was giving her back a piece of her own map, a map she had torn up and thrown away years ago. He was giving her a choice. His phone buzzed then, a harsh, unwelcome intrusion. The caller ID read, "Eleanor Croft." He looked at Ilara, at Leo, and walked into his study, closing the glass door behind him. He answered. "Julian." Her voice was ice. "I trust you have come to your senses. That woman is to be dismissed immediately. We will release a statement about Leo's spontaneous recovery due to the excellent care he's received at the Children's Hospital. We can turn this into a philanthropic triumph." Julian looked through the glass at the kitchen. Leo was now tapping a rhythm on the countertop with his spoon. Ilara, without thinking, was tapping a quiet harmony back with her fingernails. A silent conversation. A perfect composition. "No, Mother," he said, his voice calm, devoid of the anger or resentment she expected. It was the voice of a man stating an irrevocable fact. "There will be no statements. Ilara Vance is now a permanent part of this family, and you will not speak to her or about her in that manner ever again." Do you have any idea what you are throwing away? The legacy, the name. I know exactly what I'm building, he interrupted softly. And for the first time, it has nothing to do with a name or a legacy. He took a breath. You are welcome to be a part of Leo's life, but the price of admission is kindness. It is respect for the woman who saved him. Those are my only terms. The choice is yours. He ended the call before she could respond, leaving the poison to curdle on her end of the line. He felt a profound sense of release, as if he'd finally shed a skin he'd been wearing his entire life. He returned to the kitchen. Leo and Ilara stopped their silent tapping and looked at him. Was that Grandma? Leo asked. It was, Julian said, coming to stand beside him, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Is she still angry? Julian looked at Ilara, at the piece of paper with the luthier's address that she now held clutched in her hand. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of something else. Hope. I don't think it matters anymore, Julian said, answering his son but speaking to her. Some songs are over. It's time to write a new one. He met her gaze over their son's head. The path ahead was unwritten. There would be therapy and difficult conversations. There would be scars that needed tending and ghosts that would need to be gently, patiently led into the light. Ilara might never play the cello again. Leo might always carry a quiet corner inside him. But as the morning sun streamed into the kitchen, illuminating the three of them, Julian Croft knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that they were no longer defined by the silences that had broken them. They were a trio, a new composition, finding its key, learning its melody, with all the quiet, breathtaking promise of a song just beginning.